Welcome, I'm Paul Hunt, Senior Journalist at Aspermont, and this is a special edition interview for Energy News. In this episode, we focus on one key area of expertise, social license, an important part of any resource business's future. There's perhaps never been a more important time to be talking about social license or trust in communities. Social license is one of the most necessary but sometimes undervalued areas for the mining, oil and gas and general resources industry. The very definition of what it means is hotly debated. Its relevance, however, has never been more important. I'm joined today by Dr Kieren Moffat, the CEO of Voconiq, a pioneer in the social license sciences sector, to discuss these issues and more. Kieren, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It seems like an ample time to be discussing social license to operate in the resources industry, given, I guess, the tragic circumstances that Rio Tinto found itself in lately. And more broadly, why is it such an important time to be having a conversation around social license in 2021 and 2020?
Yeah, look, I think that it's always a good time to be talking about the context in which you're operating and thinking about how you're meeting or not the expectations of the communities that you operate within and interact with. So I think perhaps it's more that the conversation has matured, that more people understand the value of having that conversation and engaging in that conversation in constructive and progressive ways. I think perhaps that's why it's critical. But what I think companies understand is that you can't do business without understanding that social context and reflecting the needs and expectations of it in the way that you do business.
Well, let's take a look at, I guess, the Australian landscape in particular. I mean, every company executive that I talk to seems to have a bit of a different definition of what social license is. Can you give us yours?
Yeah, look, do you know what? I try not to get caught up in the definition because it has limited utility. It's not, strong agreement about an academic definition. But I think there are some parts of the way that we describe social license that are really important to capture and actively reflect on, much more than just sort of remembering a rote definition of social license. So for me, having done, 12, 13 years worth of academic and then, research around social license and now applying that research in the field with a business, what's key to me is that social license is about the relationship between a company and the community in which it operates. There are a couple of key components there that are worth unpacking. First of all, what is community? I think that is an age-old question and something to really think carefully about. So definitions of social license talk about communities of interest that are local to an operation, but also community that's inclusive of those that can affect a company in other ways. So they can be located in other places, they can be in other cities, in other countries. That it's their influence that determines their legitimacy in the conversation about social license. Now, every CEO that you talk to also, I'm sure, pays attention to what stakeholders are saying about their company that have the power to influence shareholders and boards and the way that the regulators, for example, determine how their business is conducted. So it's not a leap to think that actually community in other places or stakeholders in other places are also legitimate components of that social license. So there's that. And then the other piece here is the relationship. So what is the relationship? And very typically, mining and energy companies have thought about their relationship connection points in quite distinctive ways. So one, looking at impacts and benefits. So physical things like dust and noise and water quality and those sorts of things, and economic value and jobs. And then on the other hand, you have engagement specialists who go and meet with stakeholders and community members and have a relationship with them. Actually, social license brings those two spaces together, and the relationship is every interaction point that you have between a company and a community. So those two sets of ideas together show you that actually social license is multidimensional, and actually defining it is quite challenging. But what's really important in that is to continually evaluate what your relationship looks like, with whom, and how you're managing that actively. I think that's really critical.
You talk about, I guess, this definition and how you can't really define social license. And obviously, it depends on each project and each company individually. But if we could just focus for a second on geographical location of social license, I think that's a really interesting point, because if you look at something, well, if you look at recent events, whether that be Duke and Gorge, or even in the oil and gas sector, fairly recently, there was Equinor's plans to drill in the Great Australian Bight. Now, they'd all done a lot of work with local communities and some stakeholders, and many companies do. But do you think the geographical definition of social license is increasing more broadly, as in, like, once upon a time these issues would have just surrounded a few towns and the area that, say, a mining company was operating. Now it can become a real big issue on the public stage.
Yeah, look, and I think this really highlights its multi-dimensional nature, right? So, you actually can have very different perspectives amongst different stakeholders or community members, depending on where they are. So the geography component you're talking about, often, and this is, not speaking to those two cases specifically, but the observation that we've made is that, you can have communities around a proposed development site who see real opportunity for them with respect to local employment and economic activity. And also they may have experience with these kinds of developments before and have a realistic understanding of the negative impacts that also come along with large scale development, and are comfortable with that, and that they can kind of manage those two things together. And on balance, it's a positive thing. And so they're really supportive of a project. And then you can have communities in other places who take a different perspective and perhaps place that operational proposed development into some larger context, like climate change and what that might mean in a larger context. So, and be really anti. So I think that it really depends on the issue, and for companies, why this is, I guess I always look at the EY risk register every year and see that social license to operate is right up there every year in terms of risk to mining operation. And I think the same goes for energy in general. But the reason that it's consistently up there 1, 2, 3 on that list is we don't have really sophisticated ways of understanding and then managing that risk, that the ways that companies use to do that aren't working effectively enough to actually push that risk down the register. So I think that this is really telling us that there is complexity here, that's, it's okay not to have all the answers, but what we find in our work and our observation here is that actually communities at whatever scale really value companies engaging meaningfully in the conversation about that risk, about that set of interaction points they have with local communities and other communities of interest. And that companies are often very fearful of engaging in those spaces, having those conversations where they don't have all the facts, or they don't have all the answers, or they haven't made all the decisions, they haven't resolved all the uncertainties. But actually, that's kind of a problem, because that's not real life. We're all managing uncertainties around a whole bunch of things, and communities really value and place a lot of store in having a meaningful conversation as those ideas develop. And I think that's something that represents opportunity for these industries, actually, to be a little more vulnerable with those communities.
You say that, you look at the EY risk register every year and you can see that social license is always well and truly up there. Do you think that we haven't managed to find the right approach just yet? Is there a one size fits all, or is this going to take further work?
Yeah, look, I think that we're in a transition period where I think most major companies that invest in these spaces that are, just companies that see themselves as being around now and for the future understand that they need to engage in these spaces differently to how they have in the past, and that they need to develop their capacity to engage in that complexity. But that takes a little bit of time, right? It takes time to shift the direction of these very large ships. And also they're operating in, say, regulatory contexts and legal contexts that make those changes difficult to happen really quickly. But I think that where we see companies embrace the challenge, where we see companies willing to be vulnerable in those conversations, to put themselves out there and talk about those parts of their business and their history that perhaps isn't what they would like it to be or isn't appropriate now as it may have been in the past, that they get real benefit from that because they're having a mature conversation. So yeah, I think there is absolutely work to be done in this space. But there's a lot of good people in these companies that are doing that work. And I think that we're in this moment of transition where in 10 years we'll look back and think about some of the changes that are happening now and wonder why it took so long. But we still see mistakes made, absolutely. And you do wonder what is required for some companies, to see that and go, well, okay, we need the way we're doing this isn't working. The way we're structured doesn't allow us to understand and tackle those challenges in an effective way, and that maybe it's not, maybe it's us, not them, and we need to be thinking about how we can change.
You've touched on something really interesting there, Kieren, and that is sort of restructuring a business to become more vulnerable almost. Do you find that a lot of your clients or a lot of big business are a little bit hesitant to go down that path?
Yeah, absolutely. And with good cause, right? I mean, vulnerability is a difficult thing to experience. And, asking somebody else what they think about you, effectively, that's what we do, can be a scary thing to do. And that vulnerability is uncomfortable. But it is also the space for greatest opportunity. It is where the work is done in terms of creating the space to improve a relationship by exploring those parts of that relationship that are, not working very well, questioning them, redesigning them and co-designing them. So, I think it's useful to get a bit more specific here with an example. I think, we've worked with companies that practice vulnerability in their leadership training internally. So being an effective leader in a large corporation requires that you can speak freely and your team can speak freely with you. And so that requires a level of acceptance about vulnerability in that relationship that's healthy. But it needs to be practiced because it's an uncomfortable feeling, and you need to practice how that feels and works, and how do you handle it, how do you structure that conversation about your leadership style or the way that you're seeking input from. But the more you practice it, the better you get, surprisingly. And what we find is that those companies that do that kind of leadership training are then much more able to manage vulnerability external to the company context, and to be able to say to the community, look, we're interested in what you think about us, good and bad, because we want to work on those things with you. We want to restructure the way that we procure local services so that we deliver the greatest amount of value to local businesses, because we understand that is a key component of our commitment to your place. And so, of course, we want to maximize that, but that might mean we have to change, and we have to help you change with us. So let's have that conversation together rather than just saying, this is how we want to do it, and get on board that bus or find somebody else to sell that service to. So I think vulnerability is a really key component for social license, underplayed, underwritten about, under-discussed, but is actually fundamental to progress in developing stronger, deeper, more constructive relationships with community.
My guest today is Dr. Kieren Moffat, CEO of Voconiq, a social license, social science company which is leading the conversation around trust in communities, especially in the resources and agriculture business. Before we go any further, Kieren, I think it's good for our listeners to get a bit more of an understanding of who Voconiq actually is. You mentioned that you do go out there and do a little bit of consulting work, but that's not just who Voconiq is it? Can you give us a bit of an overview of exactly what the company is?
Yeah, sure. And actually, it's really useful to think about where we've come from, because that tells you really a lot about why we do the things that we do, which is really the core of the business. So over about 10 or 11 years, I led a research program in CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency, to look at the nature of the relationships between communities and companies and industries that work alongside them, and to really understand what is it that leads to stronger, deeper, more constructive relationships. In doing that science, what we did was to determine the key drivers of acceptance of those companies and industries, and what are the key levers that those companies and industries can pull to improve their level of acceptance. What we found in that process was that trust in a company was fundamental to its level of acceptance. And so a lot of our research then focused on, well, what is it that leads to deeper trust? And what we found in CSIRO is a strong demand for that skill set, that capacity, that science. And we built a service around that science, which is effectively what Voconiq is. It's a service that delivers that cutting edge science to companies and industries in 5 countries now, and in 60 communities in those five countries locally, and also to more than a dozen industries in the agricultural space as well at the national scale, where we bring citizen perspectives into their industry. So Voconiq is a vehicle for this science to be able to deliver it at scale all around the world and help companies to connect more effectively with their communities, to reduce their level of social risk, and to improve the lives of the communities that work alongside them. We use social science methods that are now built on a technology platform, so that we can do that consistently anywhere in the world, and to deliver really important, insightful data insights through dashboards and things like that to our customers anywhere. And it's really interesting work. It's meaningful work for my team and myself, and Voconiq has big plans for the future as well about how we want to take that science forward.
Can you give us a bit of an example, or can you give us an example of a company that you've worked with and the results that you've seen out of that?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you 2 actually. So the first one is with a company called Yamana Gold, Toronto-based Canadian gold mining company, but they have multiple operations in Latin America. And so they're challenged there by geography and culture, and how do you build a consistent culture of social performance in those sites in contexts like Brazil and Chile and Argentina, where perhaps they're on a curve to improve in those areas, but aren't as advanced as in some other places. Working with teams that are doing really good work locally, but again, they're working from a different place. And so what we started doing with Yamana was to articulate in data the nature of the relationship they had with a local community, say in Brazil. And what we showed them was that they had a real risk area around blast impacts on houses that were in a particular neighbourhood close to a site. And it was challenging for that local team to embrace that and to reshape their engagement efforts, because they had a strategy in place. They then had a conflict, and actually it wasn't great. And then that really acted as a trigger for them to take the local voices data that we're providing to them every quarter, which tells them where communities are at in terms of that relationship. And they reorganized their strategy for community engagement and investment around the things that we could show them in the data, the science, that were the key drivers of a stronger, more trusting relationship. And what we saw from that over the next 12 months was that trust in the company increased significantly and dramatically, to the point where they reduced their social risk significantly in quite a short period of time, just by aligning their actions to the needs and expectations of community. And it seems really simple, but actually it's incredibly difficult in practice to reorganize the way a mining company engages the community in terms of the community's priorities rather than yours. And that requires courage and appetite for vulnerability and the willingness to try something new. And they did that really effectively. The other example is in Australia, in Kalgoorlie. We work with a fantastic team at the KCGM site there, so Super Pit.
Yeah.
And they took the data from our first anchor survey, benchmarking survey. They really embraced it and they dived into that data themselves and went, okay, look, we need to reinvigorate our relationship here in Kalgoorlie Boulder. So who are the people in the community that have really strong relationships already? And can we build relationships with them to understand how they do that well and to work with them to build our own relationships? And they did that and started building new relationships with chambers of commerce there and with local business people. And again, in the data, we were able to show that paid dividends. And so when they walked into the COVID emergency period, they had built their relationships with local businesses who, of course, was badly hit by COVID, to the extent that they could then work back out to those groups and say, well, what can we do to support you? How do we help you in this context? And I think that's, beautiful case study where by understanding what the whole of community think, taking those data insights and digesting and reflecting on them and then doing something with them, that paid off down the track in ways they could never have predicted because we never saw this coming, but had real benefits for both community, small business and the company as well.
I think that nicely segues into another sort of area of discussion, and that is how has COVID-19 and the financial and economic impact of COVID, what effect has that had on social license?
Yeah, I think it has been fascinating for us looking at the data coming.
So you've done a comprehensive study on this?
Well, what we did is that all of the projects, all of the customers that we're working with, we were collecting data anyway through this period, because our approach is that not only do we want to get a point in time understanding of those relationships with a community, but actually we want to track them across time because the relationship is live, it's dynamic.
Yeah.
And so we collect data typically quarterly, but even monthly for some customers. And that allows us to tap in real time to the nature of that relationship. Through COVID, though, what it allowed us to do is to see how things changed as the situation developed, which is incredibly fascinating because, early on we saw what was coming. And so we organized our data collection around COVID. So we were measuring community fears and concerns and anxieties across a whole range of dimensions, from local business economic impacts through to feelings of isolation and concern about children at school and all sorts of things that were on all of our minds, right? And then we were, as time progressed, looking at how people were perceiving, company responses and efforts that were being made. And what was seriously interesting through this was that we saw trust in those companies that were engaging effectively in the space increase significantly, pretty universally.
Okay.
And so I think what that means is that people are looking at their relationship with that local mining company in a new light.
Yeah.
I think it showed them that those mining companies and energy companies weren't just a local employer, they weren't just a multinational, they weren't just down the road. They were actually really important local institutions. They were symbols of continuity and reassurance that life would continue, because it seems like an age ago, but in those early times, we really had no idea how this was going to play out. And it happened so rapidly that, we were tracking changes in this data day to day. And so what we saw is that, trust and acceptance in those companies improved significantly. It has since come off a little bit, actually, as communities have got back to business as usual. That, of course, coincided with a lot of companies investing a lot of resources in supporting communities in really tangible, meaningful ways. But what's really interesting in that data for me is that the main driver of that improvement in trust seemed to be quality of interaction with company personnel. And if you imagine at that time, what happened was that we weren't allowed to be in the same room as each other. So all of the typical ways that community engagement teams were engaging were off the table. So agendaed meetings and formal stakeholder meetings, those sorts of things all stopped. But what happened was that those community engagement professionals were picking up the phone and having really short but meaningful conversations with those community members and stakeholders. They were checking in with them, seeing how they were coping, seeing how the company could assist, giving that reassurance verbally. But more importantly, they were having a real relationship with them in real time at a moment of real need. And I think that was key in that. And I think that's the key lesson that we are trying to help our customers to take forward off the back of that emergency period, which is that don't forget, people really valued those specific activities where you were connecting meaningfully with community members in that moment. And, you know, often in the fray of a really busy work agenda, we kind of lose that a little bit. And I think those were really meaningful to community members. And if you could take anything forward, it would be, you know, don't lose sight of the fact that agendaed meetings are important for things like making decisions and formal parts of agreements and whatnot, but the relationship lives somewhere else, and you've got to always kind of attend and maintain that.
So, Kieren, is it more of a individualistic approach that needs to be taken more often? Do we need to be speaking to people on a more individual basis than just hosting a workshop or a discussion?
Well, I think actually it's not about individualistic, I don't think. I think it's about stepping back and thinking about what the relationship needs.
Yeah.
So thinking actively about that. And that's really challenging in an incredibly busy, resource-constrained work life that we see most community engagement specialists. That's their reality. But if you can step back and reflect on what that relationship needs, that's going to help you align your behavior and your allocation of resources to the things that in effect are going to make your job easier, because you're going to have your finger on that pulse. And, you know, that's where we start to try and work into that relationship by helping those practitioners with a shorthand, you know, a shortcut to the critical issues for particular groups in particular places at a moment in time. That, you know, here are the top 3 things that that community is thinking about right now. And if you were to have a conversation, if you were to have 5 minutes with somebody, here's 3 questions you could ask them. And I think that's a really neat way to frame this. What questions could I be asking in that conversation, rather than what do I want to tell them?
Yeah.
So I think it's about reorganizing how we interact in those contexts, and you know, that's going to have real dividend.
No easy feat, though, when you know, we've been doing things a certain way for a very long period of time.
Really hard. But then the EY risk register is exactly why it's absolutely worth trying something new, and it's absolutely worth thinking about every part of that relationship and my role in it, and trying systematically then to address that risk. So yeah, I think it is absolutely the moment to be having a crack at that.
My guest today is Dr. Kieren Moffat, CEO of Voconiq. Kieren, you mentioned earlier in our discussion that you'd seen this huge rise in, I guess, trust and social license during COVID. And it was those, you know, the personal engagement with communities that really made a huge difference. I guess the glaring elephant in the room this year has been Juukan Gorge. Has that undermined trust, and will we ever get back from that?
Yeah, look, I think that was a terrible incident and an issue for Rio Tinto that I have no doubt will echo within that company for forever. And is, you know, and you know, we work with people from Rio Tinto, and this is really challenging for them as well, because you know, a lot of, and this has been reported, this isn't me revealing anything that isn't already been in the papers, but feeling like, you know, this was something that doesn't feel like the company that I signed up to you know, be employed by. So I think it's challenging for everybody. And, going forward, what's really important is that lessons are learned, of course, right? And that we shake up the way that we think about risk by looking at the relationship through the eyes of community members and through the eyes of stakeholders, and to think about the stake that they're defending, the stake that they're holding, and to really get back to first principles here. And I think that's the challenge. What I think actually has happened, and because we have data on this, is that has been largely contained in local communities to those communities around Rio Tinto, but rather than being an industry-wide phenomenon. But I think actually community sentiment more broadly towards mining companies isn't particularly positive in any case. And so I think rather than this sort of destroying, this huge well of trust that exists, I think the greater risk is that it reinforces the perspectives that some people hold about this industry, when in fact the mining industry is incredibly progressive and has invested a lot of energy in trying to be better in these places, because it has lived with these very real decisions and risks in its relationship with community forever, because resources are at the center of every great human challenge. And so they have a lot of practice in working through and being part of those conversations. And so more than most industries, mining and resources in general understand the complexity of them. And so, I'm not quick to judge, because I think they are, challenging, complex environments to operate. But the things that have happened there were things that others were talking about as being a real risk for that company. And you'd hope that here is a chance for reflection, not just for Rio, but for the industry in general, and to be thinking, what does the science tell us is important here? What do people who spend their lives focusing on these things tell us are really critical? And to, not to take that on board, but just to use it to reflect on how we do business as a company.
I'd like to ask another question, which relates to another big issue in our society, and particularly for the resources industry, and that is climate change. I mean, this is also an issue for the agricultural sector as well. Fairly recently, you've had FMG, Rio Tinto, a lot of big resource companies in Australia looking to, replace the fuels that their trucks are using, and make some real progressive steps to eliminate their carbon dioxide emissions amongst other emissions, when we and even electrify some of their vehicles, which is incredible in itself. When you look at something like that, it's not actually publicly well known. Are we, as an industry, is the mining sector and the oil and gas sector doing enough to sell their story of the efforts that they're going to because resources, as we know, are going to be so important to our economic recovery from COVID, but just generally speaking, they're our biggest exports. Are we underselling or not communicating the things that we are doing right as an industry?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I, drawing agriculture into this conversation as well. So yeah, interestingly, resources and agriculture, two industries that have kind of been powering through COVID and really doing a lot to support our country here in Australia and to participate in that global economy, which, as you say, will be so important for recovery and actually continuity through this period. I think that absolutely those two industries or sets of industries can be telling and are trying to tell that story about innovation in the global context in which they operate effectively. But it's also a crowded, critical landscape. And so, if you're wanting to talk about how you're reducing your emissions as a company, then you have 10 more voices talking about, how your products contribute to global emissions, more generally. And, And so those responsible steps that a company or an industry might be seeking to take can be lost in that to and fro in that argument. Where I think industries kind of fall down a little bit is by focusing on those extreme perspectives and attending to them, defending themselves against them, and missing, I think, the larger conversation, the more important conversation, which is with community more generally, and to have that conversation in interesting, novel, vulnerable ways. I think that is in fact the way forward, because and we see this in the data that we collect at that national scale, say with the rural industries, Trust in Rural Industries project that we're doing at the moment, involving 12 different Australian rural industries, is that when those industries can build trust with community, they actually build the space for innovation. Because trust is about benefit of the doubt when things go wrong. Innovation is effectively a series of failures on the way towards a different way of doing things. To be able to fail effectively, to be able to fail and learn, requires that the community, for example, is willing to let you, is willing to see you try to improve, not get it right, to iterate and try it again. And that requires trust in that relationship. And so I think building, a stronger, larger conversation with the community in general is absolutely the way to build deeper levels of trust, which allows those industries to innovate more effectively, and then to tell that story back to community and almost to repay that faith, and to say that, hey, we know this rural industry is water intensive. That's why we want to work on making it less water intensive and more complementary in the way that it operates alongside other industries here, or environmental concerns, and for resources to think about, well, actually, we're diversifying our portfolio not just for shareholder value, but because we want to be part of that future, and that requires particular critical minerals. And we want to be bringing our expertise as a multinational mining company with decades of experience in how to do that most efficiently to that problem. And so I think that's why it's important to be building larger, stronger relationships with community at that level, rather than focusing so heavily on those critical voices that have a platform. They're always going to be there. They're always going to criticize you. And if you address that concern, they shift to something else. And I don't think you're ever going to change their mind. And you spend a lot of energy trying to defend a position that actually doesn't speak too strongly, too directly to what matters, which is the larger context, the relationship with the community as a whole.
I'd like to get your thoughts on a story I found out about a few weeks ago. Here in Perth, we're able to gather, and I went to a.
Lucky you.
Yeah, I know, it's great. I feel sorry for you guys over in Queensland and the eastern states, but there was a conversation held at the Como here in Perth, and it was the chief executive of one of Australia's largest fishing companies called Austral, and a conversation with the director, or the Australian director of Sea Shepherd. And they were talking about how they had worked together through a partnership, which, you would think would be one of the most unlikely partnerships to come about, this massive fishing company and Sea Shepherd, where they came together to stop Patagonian toothfish poaching in southern Australian waters, and then more broadly about looking together and finding a way for Austral to become carbon neutral, and the benefits that had both for shareholders and for social license and working with community groups. How important are partnerships like this?
Oh, look, I think those are the stories that inspire us, right? I mean, that is where there is so much opportunity. And there's actually lots of stories like that, often stories like that don't make it into the papers or into the conference room, right? I think that where those mutual interests are identified, and you can work proactively and constructively with, erstwhile combatants, then I think amazing things are possible. And that's about sharing perspectives and thinking about what's in common here and the larger purpose. So I think, absolutely those things are really amazing when you hear about them, and incredibly productive. And I think speak to the principle, I just mentioned about building relationships rather than fighting battles. So I think the progressive companies that we work with, progressive industries that we work with, like, for example, Australian Eggs are always willing to engage in the conversation with their critics. And that isn't because, they're just really lovely people, they're nice people, but actually because there's value in that. And why would you close off those conversations? Why wouldn't you try and open them up? And at some point in the future, that may turn to, something productive you can do together. And it looks like those two found the perfect space to operate in. And the magic in that is that by doing that, they then find other opportunities, right? And you see that, they're not two-headed monsters, that actually they're a person like me. They're passionate about the same industry as I am, and they're just passionate about different parts of it. And actually, if we were to be creative and think together, maybe there are ways to address both of our passions in that space in a way that's complementary. So, I think obviously those are great opportunities.
Kieren, if you had 3 pieces of advice for the energy sector, the mining sector, and the agricultural sector too, what would it be?
3 pieces of advice. All right. Well, look, I think that my first piece of advice is, don't assume the answer. You really need to understand the nature of the problem that you're seeking to address. And I'm speaking now about that social context, because that's my domain of expertise. So often we can read the papers, we can hang out on Twitter, we can see the comments on Facebook, and we can think that that's how everybody thinks about our industry. And in fact, over and over again, our research shows that the story is much more nuanced than that. And there are positive parts in every relationship as well as challenges, of course, because it's a relationship and that's how the world is. So my first piece of advice would be to step back and not assume that you know what that relationship looks like with, say, the Australian community or community of interest, and to test those assumptions with science, to actually bring the tools that have been honed over time to bear on that challenge, to understand where you are right now. And that really should tell you, in a structured, systematic way, the best way to take the next step. And that step should be forward. It should be forward into the space between you and those communities that you're looking to build trust with. So, that would be my first and probably largest piece of advice, is to just step back and evaluate the context in which you're operating. The second is to embrace vulnerability, that it is scary, it is difficult, it is challenging, and it takes courage. But, for those industries and companies that do it, the benefits are there, and they're there in data, and you can see it and you can communicate that story. And the latest CSIRO research with Australian Eggs shows that over 3 years, that industry improved its level of community trust significantly year on year by focusing on the things that matter most to the Australian community in their industry space. So the evidence is clear that when you embrace vulnerability, that's where the benefits are. And the third piece of advice I would say is that if you're looking for a differentiator, if you're looking for a way to set yourself apart, be the first to that sustainability space. Be the first in that space that is going well beyond community expectation, to work in partnership with community at different scales, using those insights to drive your activities at the areas that mean most and are going to give you the greatest bang for your investment dollar, and sit back and reap the reward. So I think those would be the 3 pieces of advice, that in fact this kind of work, this kind of effort is a critical differentiator in many industries, and will be increasingly so in the future.
We're going to have to leave it there. Dr. Kieren Moffat, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
you.